Hey everyone, welcome back. And special shout out to all our UPSC aspirants listening in today. We're diving into a topic that's pretty crucial for both your mains and prelims exams.
Absolutely. We're talking about state finances in India.
State finances.
Yeah, and it's not just about, numbers and budgets. It's about understanding the whole, the dynamics of power,
Yeah,
autonomy, and how development plays out within our federal structure.
for sure. And get this, the Hindu newspaper recently put out a report that's got us thinking. Some Indian states seem to be leaning more and more on the central government, for their finances.
Right.
It's like, imagine you've got your job, you're an adult, you're out there, but you still got to hit up mom and dad for a loan every now and then.
Exactly.
So we got to ask, what does this increasing dependence mean for a state's ability to kind of chart its own path, make its own decisions, and, really drive its own development?
Yeah, that's the big question. And what we're seeing is a pretty significant trend. Over the past decade, the share of state revenue that comes from central transfers and grants has really jumped up.
Okay, so we're not just talking about a hunch here, right? There's actual data, hard numbers to back this up.
Oh, yeah. The Hindu report specifically points out that states' own tax revenue has consistently been below 50% of their total revenue for the last 10 years.
Wow.
That's a big deal.
That is a significant chunk of their income essentially coming from the central government.
Yeah.
So the question is why? Why is this happening?
Right.
I mean, are states just not pulling their weight? Are they not doing enough to generate their own revenue?
Well, it's complicated. It's definitely not a simple answer. There are a lot of factors at play here. I mean, first off, you got to consider the pandemic.
Right.
That threw a massive wrench into everyone's budget.
Absolutely.
Especially at the state level. They suddenly had to increase spending on healthcare and social safety nets, while their revenue streams were shrinking.
It's like a double whammy, right? Like expenses are going through the roof while income's taking a nosedive.
Exactly.
I can see how that puts them in a tough spot.
Yeah, and even beyond the immediate impact of the pandemic, there's this kind of ongoing issue of declining efficiency in tax collection.
Oh, really?
Yeah, things like stamp duty and registration fees. These are usually big sources of revenue for states,
Right.
but the systems for collecting them aren't always so efficient. Lots of revenue leakage.
It's like having a leaky faucet in your house.
Mhm.
You're losing water even though it's right there.
Perfect analogy.
You're supposed to be getting it, but it's just dripping away.
And then on top of that, you've got the issue of low dividends from state-owned enterprises.
Yeah.
In theory, these enterprises should be making money and contributing to the state's coffers.
Yeah.
But in reality, a lot of them aren't performing as well as they could be.
Okay, so we've got the pandemic effect, we've got the leaky tax collection bucket,
Right.
and we've got these underperforming state-owned enterprises. So all of these things together are feeding into this growing dependence on the center. But the big question here, and the one that I think our listeners really want to understand, is what are the implications of this dependence? Why should we be worried about it? What are the real-world consequences for the states?
Well, the thing is, this dependence, it might seem like a quick fix in the short term, but in the long run, it can actually weaken a state's fiscal autonomy, their ability to make their own decisions about their finances.
Okay, so they're kind of losing control over their own destiny in a way.
In a way, yeah. I mean, imagine you're a state leader, you've got all these ideas, you've got this vision for your region, but your hands are tied because you're constantly having to rely on the central government for funding.
It's like having all the ingredients for this amazing meal, but you don't have a stove to cook it on.
Exactly.
You can't actually bring your vision to life.
Like limited.
So states could end up stuck, unable to fund
Yeah.
crucial projects. They can't implement policies that are tailored to their specific needs.
Exactly. And the Hindu report actually highlights a really good example of this. There was this state that had this ambitious irrigation project.
Okay.
It was all set to go, but then it stalled because of delays in central funding.
Wow.
And that delay had a domino effect. It impacted agricultural output and ultimately hurt the state's economy.
It's like a chain reaction. One thing leads to another, and suddenly you've got this much bigger problem.
Right.
So it's not just some abstract concept, right?
Whoa.
This dependence has tangible negative consequences. It affects real people's lives. It affects development. And I imagine it probably creates some tension between the center and the states as well.
Oh, absolutely. When states feel like they're at the mercy of the center for their funding, it can breed resentment. It can make
Right.
it harder to cooperate on policies. It can lead to friction. And, this whole issue ties in directly with your UPSC preparation.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're talking about fiscal, federalism, center-state relations, economic development.
Big concepts.
Huge. And understanding these nuances can really give you an edge in your exams.
It's not just about memorizing definitions, right?
No.
It's about understanding the complex web of relationships and implications here.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've painted a bit of a bleak picture here. We've talked about the challenges, the potential downsides of this dependence. But before we go too far down that road, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about solutions. What can states do to regain control of their finances? How can they break free from this dependence on the Sanders?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what we'll be digging into in part 2 of our deep dive. We're going to explore some really innovative approaches that states are taking to boost their revenue and really strengthen their financial muscles. There are some bright spots out there.
Okay, so there's hope.
Oh, yeah.
We're not completely doomed.
Not at all.
All right, so for all you UPSC warriors out there, make sure you tune in to part 2, where we get into the nitty-gritty of solutions.
It's going to be good.
And in the meantime, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, share this episode with your fellow aspirants. And just a reminder that this deep dive is based on some excellent reporting from the Hindu newspaper.
They did a great job on this one.
So kudos to them for bringing this important issue to light. All right, we'll see you in part 2.
See you then. Welcome back, everyone. So we spent part 1 talking about some of the challenges that states are facing when it comes to their finances, this growing dependence on the central government. But like we promised, we're going to shift gears now and look at some potential solutions. Some states are actually taking some pretty proactive steps to, kind of regain control of their finances.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear about these bright spots you mentioned.
Yeah.
Which states are kind of leading the charge here?
Well, one state that stands out is Tamil Nadu. They've been really focusing on reforming their property tax system,
Okay.
which, remember, we talked about earlier, is often a big source of revenue leakage for states.
Right, those leaky buckets.
Yeah, exactly. Those leaky buckets. So Tamil Nadu, they realized, we're losing a lot of potential revenue here. We got to fix this.
So how did they do it? Did they just jack up property taxes across the board?
No, it's not that simple. They took a much more strategic approach. I mean, the first thing they did was they made sure that property tax assessments were actually reflecting current market values.
Yeah.
So, a lot of times those assessments are outdated.
Right.
And people are paying taxes based on what their property was worth 10 years ago.
Makes sense.
So they updated all of that.
So it's when you get a raise at work, you got to adjust your budget accordingly. You can't keep living on your old salary.
Exactly. You got to update your numbers. But they didn't stop there. They also simplified the whole tax collection process.
Oh, okay.
So they made it easier for people to actually pay their taxes. They introduced online payment options, streamlined the procedures.
User-friendly.
Exactly, make it easy. And they even started using technology to identify properties that weren't even on the tax rolls, the ones that were slipping through the cracks.
Oh, wow.
So it was this combination of getting the numbers right and making the system more user-friendly.
Smart. So did it actually work?
It did. The Hindu report mentions that Tamil Nadu saw a significant increase in property tax revenue after they implemented all these reforms.
Okay, that's encouraging. So it's not just, some pie-in-the-sky idea. It actually translates into real results.
Right. It proves that these kinds of reforms can actually pay off if they're done strategically.
Absolutely. Are there other states that have kind of taken a similar approach?
Yeah. Telangana is another one.
Okay.
They've also been doing some really interesting things with property tax reform. They implemented this system that uses technology to assess property values. It takes into account the location, the size, the amenities, all these different factors.
Fancy.
Yeah, and it makes the whole assessment process much more accurate and also more transparent.
Right, because transparency is key, especially when it comes to taxes.
Absolutely.
People are much more likely to comply when they understand how the system works and they feel like it's fair.
Right. If you feel like you're being ripped off, you're less likely to want to pay.
Exactly.
Mm.
But are states limited to just reforming their property tax systems? Are there other ways they can boost revenue?
Oh, absolutely. Some states are getting really creative.
Okay.
They're exploring all sorts of new revenue sources. For example, a few states have started experimenting with environmental taxes.
Oh, interesting.
So this is taxing things that pollute.
Okay.
And it not only brings in more money, but it also incentivizes people to adopt more environmentally friendly practices.
So it's like hitting two birds with one stone.
Exactly. You're generating revenue and you're also promoting sustainable development.
Smart. Okay, so we've got some inspiring success stories here, but I'm sure it's not all smooth sailing, right?
Of course not.
What are some of the roadblocks that states face when they try to implement these kinds of reforms?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is pushback from vested interests. Anytime you try to change the way things work,
Right.
there are always going to be people who benefit from the status quo.
The old way.
Yeah, and they're not always happy about change.
Makes sense. Change can be scary.
Yeah, especially when it affects people's wallets. So, for example, when states try to update property tax assessments, they often get a lot of resistance from property owners who were used to paying lower taxes under the old system.
Understandable.
So it's a delicate balance.
So how do states navigate that resistance? How do they convince people that these reforms are actually good for everyone in the long run?
Well, communication is key.
Right.
They need to explain very clearly why they're doing this, what the benefits are going to be for the state as a whole.
Transparency.
Transparency is huge. The whole process needs to be open and fair so people don't feel like they're being unfairly targeted.
So it's about building trust,
Mm.
bringing people along on the journey.
Yeah, exactly. But then there's also the challenge of capacity. Do state governments actually have the expertise, the resources, the commitment to really implement these reforms effectively?
Right. Because it's one thing to have a good idea, but it's another thing entirely to actually put it into action.
That's where technology and data analytics can be really helpful.
Okay.
By using these tools, states can streamline their processes, improve efficiency, make more data-driven decisions.
So it's about combining smart policy ideas with smart implementation strategies.
Exactly. And remember, it's an ongoing process. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Each state has its own unique context and its own challenges.
Right. So it's like this laboratory of democracy. Everyone's experimenting, trying different things, learning from each other.
Exactly.
But let's bring this back to our UPSC aspirants for a second.
Mm.
What are the key takeaways they should be gleaning from these state-level successes?
Well, I think it's important to understand the specifics of what states like Tamil Nadu and Telangana have done, but the real gold here is understanding the underlying principles. The UPSC exam is not about rote memorization. It's about critical thinking, analytical skills.
It's about connecting the dots.
Exactly. So think of it like building a mental toolkit that you can use to analyze any policy issue, whether it's state finances, education, healthcare, whatever.
So it's not just about acing the exam. It's about developing a framework for understanding how to solve real-world problems.
Right.
That's awesome. But before we move on to the bigger picture, I have a question. Is it realistic to expect all states to be able to replicate these success stories? Are there inherent limitations that might prevent some states from achieving similar results?
That's a really good question, and that actually leads us perfectly into our final part where we're going to zoom out and explore the broader implications of state finances for India's overall economic growth.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive. We've talked about the challenges states are facing with their finances. We've looked at some of the solutions some states are trying. But now I want to zoom out a little bit. Look at the big picture. How does all of this, the state-of-state finances, how does that impact India's overall economic growth?
Well, India's aiming for some pretty ambitious economic growth in the coming years.
Right.
And to achieve that, we need a strong economy, not just at the national level, but at the state level, too.
Yeah, makes sense.
And this is where it gets really interesting. When states have the resources, when they have the autonomy to invest in things like infrastructure, education, healthcare, it creates this ripple effect.
Okay.
It creates jobs, it attracts, invests. It ultimately fuels economic growth, not just within that state, but across the country.
So strong state finances lead to a stronger national economy.
Exactly.
Which benefits everyone.
Everyone. But like you mentioned earlier, there's a balance here, right? We want to encourage growth at the state level, but we also don't want to jeopardize the overall fiscal stability of the nation.
Right. Right. It's like walking a tightrope.
It is a tightrope.
Yeah.
And that's where the concept of fiscal federalism comes into play.
Okay.
It's this idea of, finding that sweet spot where states have enough autonomy to manage their own finances and drive their own development.
Right.
But at the same time, we're ensuring that the national economy remains stable and sustainable.
Okay. I think maybe just for our listeners who might not be super familiar with this term, could you just break down what fiscal federalism actually means, in a practical sense?
Sure. So basically, fiscal federalism is all about how financial powers and responsibilities are divided between the central government and the states.
Okay.
It's like a partnership. Both sides have clearly defined roles when it comes to raising revenue, when it comes to spending money.
It's about making sure everyone's pulling their weight,
Mm.
but also that everyone has the resources they need to do their part.
Exactly. And it's about striking that balance between giving states enough freedom to flourish,
Right.
but also, making sure that the national economy is healthy.
It's a tough balance.
It is. There's no magic formula, but there are some principles that can kind of guide us. I mean, first of all, states need a reliable and predictable source of revenue.
Makes sense.
That means the system for sharing tax revenue between the center and the states has to be fair, transparent, adaptable. The needs of states change over time,
Right.
so the system needs to be flexible enough to accommodate that.
It's like, making sure everyone has a fair slice of the pie and that the size of the slices can be adjusted as needed. But isn't this where things often get a little tricky? The division of resources between the center and the states. It can be a point of contention.
Absolutely. Different states have different needs,
Right.
they have different priorities, and so there's always going to be some negotiation involved. But that's why it's so important to have clear rules, transparency, open communication.
So everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, exactly. But revenue sharing is only one part of the equation. States also need the autonomy to decide how to spend that revenue. They need the flexibility to design programs that are tailored to their specific needs.
So it's not just about the amount of money. It's also about the freedom to use that money effectively.
Exactly. But of course, with greater autonomy comes greater responsibility.
Right.
We can't just give states a bunch of money and say, good luck. We need to make sure they're using it wisely, that they're accountable for the outcomes.
So it's a two-way street. States get more freedom, but they also need to show that they can handle that freedom responsibly.
Right. Transparency is key here. Things
Yeah.
like open budgeting processes, performance monitoring, independent audits.
Checks and balances.
Exactly. All of that helps to ensure that states are actually using the funds effectively and achieving the desired results.
So it sounds like this balance between autonomy and accountability. It's an ongoing process, a constant negotiation.
It is. It requires a lot of dialogue, collaboration, a shared commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our UPSC aspirants one last time.
Okay.
What are the key takeaways here when it comes to this relationship between state finances and national economic growth?
Well, the UPSC exam is not about memorizing a bunch of facts. It's about understanding the nuances of these complex issues, being able to think critically.
Right.
So for aspirants, I think the key is to really grasp the core principles of fiscal federalism,
Okay.
to understand how revenue sharing works, how states get the autonomy to spend their money, and to be able to analyze how all of that affects a state's ability to contribute to national economic growth.
It's about connecting the dots, seeing the big picture, understanding how these seemingly separate issues are actually intertwined.
Exactly. It's about developing that sophisticated understanding of how our federal system works, both in theory and in practice.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. I feel like I've learned a lot.
Me too.
We've explored the challenges, the potential solutions, the implications for India's economic future. A huge thank you to our expert for walking us through all of this.
It's been a pleasure.
And to all our UPSC warriors out there, remember, this isn't just about passing an exam. This is about equipping yourselves with the knowledge and the insights to help build a stronger, more prosperous India.
Absolutely.
And before we wrap up, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Share this episode with your fellow aspirants. And just a reminder that this deep dive was based on some excellent reporting from the Hindu newspaper.
Great resource.
So big thanks to them for shedding light on this important issue. All right, that's all for today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everyone.